Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation, Building Futures in Rural Scotland. Thank you for joining us today. This event is organised by SEDA Land, part of the Scottish Ecological Design Association. My name is Megan McInnes, and I'm going to be your chair for this afternoon's conversation. I am a Scottish Land Commissioner and also the Local Development Manager with the Applecross Community Company, where I'm joining you from today. This is the third in a series of 4 conversations about sustainable placemaking in rural Scotland and what is needed to help reverse the declining populations that are projected. The recordings of our first event, which focused on the broad topic, and the second event, which focused on the role of local authorities, are available on the SEDA website. This third conversation builds on those two and focuses in on the role that local communities and local organisations play in developing their own affordable housing and community spaces and facilities. What are the barriers and what further support is needed to those groups to be able to continue to do this and do this more and do it better? Delivering more affordable houses in Applecross here is one of my tasks, so this is a topic very much close to my heart, and we're really lucky to have gathered together a great range of speakers from other community groups and organisations involved in supporting communities across Scotland to discuss this all further. As with all SEDA conversations, I'll be asking the panellists for contributions which are passionate, provocative, and also positive and solution focused. Unfortunately, we've had one of our speakers, Kate Hagman from the Dumfries and Galloway Council, has had to withdraw at the last moment, but she has kindly given me her provocation, which I'll give as a contribution later in this discussion. The format of this conversation will be similar to most other SEDA Land conversations. It's going to be divided into 2 parts. We'll start with a short presentation from each panellist. Then there'll be a short panel discussion between the panellists that I shall chair, and then we'll have a Q&A session with the audience. And then between these sections, there are going to be some very important interludes from a range of different artists who feel passionately about the sense of place living in rural Scotland. Excuse me. We'll also be making you work as well as part of this conversation by asking you to complete some polls. In fact, the first poll question should be coming up now. And this is simply asking you to describe yourself. What kind of hat are you wearing at this conversation? Maybe like me, you're wearing more than one. So please choose as many as you want to describe yourself. And while you are answering this, I'm going to give Stephen, one of the background team, a chance to collate the answers by running through some of the housekeeping. The chat box is going to be open throughout the event. Please use this to submit questions to the panel or to leave comments and general queries which can be picked up by the back of house team. We found in the previous conversations that this chat function has been an incredibly exciting and interesting conversation that's been part of the recording. So I hope we can see the same thing happening again this afternoon. But I do want to remind you, of course, that that chat is public and the transcript will be available to organisers after the event. So please don't put anything in there that you don't want us to see. And finally, as you will already know, this event is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the Land SEDA Resources webpage in a few days. So, Stephen, do we have the results of that first panel? Okay, so let's have a look. We have 45%, so nearly half of people are involved in a community group or development trust. We have 43% is our rural residents. We've got 24% are architects, and then we've got representatives from rural business, and let me see what else. And some people who don't feel that they fit any of the categories above. That's really interesting. So it's really great to see that we've got strong representation from community groups or development trusts. I hope you will feel able to share your experiences and ask questions of the panelists when we get to that part of the session. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first speaker, The speakers' biographies are on the website for this event, so I'm not going to waste our very precious time by giving them introduction, but our first speaker will be Wendy Reid from Rural Housing Scotland. Please go ahead, Wendy.
Great. Thanks for that, Megan. And I hope that I managed to stick to my allotted 5 minutes. If not, feel free to cut me off. My name's Wendy Reid, and I work for I'm a board member of Rural Housing Service, but I also am the development manager for Ulva, on Ulva, which is the community-owned island taken into ownership by North West Mull Community Woodland Company off the northwest coast of Mull. And one of the first things that we had to grapple with Ulva was housing and repopulation. So with both my hats with the Rural Housing Scotland and the experience on Ulva, it's previous to that, I should also say that I used to work for the Development Trust Association Scotland, and my experience over all those years is that housing is becoming more and more and more of an issue at community level, and that it's something that needs to be seen in a broader context. So with Rural Housing Scotland, we've been doing some work on looking at what we believe the importance of housing is, and I'm sure none of this will become as new to you. But what's become apparent to us and to me through my work is that housing is so important that it underpins local jobs, the economic development, health and education in places, repopulation, tourism. So really, it underpins the whole community wellbeing agenda that's being promoted at the moment by Scottish Government. In terms of communities being involved in community-led, in delivering housing, more and more communities over the years have started to have to undertake community housing projects, as we know. And I suppose one of my questions is, why is it that communities are having to do this for themselves? Are they really the right people? And it's not because I don't think they can do it well. I just question whether whether they are the best people for doing the job. And it seems to me that, as ever with communities and community empowerment, more and more and more is being expected of communities to deliver, but very little resourcing is given to them to enable them to do that. So my contention, I suppose, and this is not something that's just new off the that I've come up with today for the purposes of this seminar, but it's something that DTA Scotland has been campaigning for many years, and many others. And it's really to do with the way in which communities are funded to deliver large-scale capital projects. Funding for capital works is relatively easy to get, and I say that knowing the process that you have to go through, which is funding applications, etc., etc., etc. But there's a lot of capital funding available. What's not available or easily available is revenue funding for a community organisation to enable them to have the staff in place and the finances in place that give them the confidence to undertake over a long term large-scale capital projects. And I was reflecting on this over the weekend when I was reading, last week, when I picked up an article written by Rhoda Meek in the National newspaper entitled "Rural Communities Can't Survive on Volunteers Alone." And this really picked up on this idea that we are dependent on communities and a lot of volunteer effort, whereas other organisations that are encouraging communities to take up these projects and to deliver on some of these national agendas have a lot of paid staff and get funding for paid staff and core revenue budgets. So for me, one of the critical things is about how do we resource communities effectively to enable them to successfully deliver on these types of projects and deliver on the housing aspirations that we've got and starting to meet the needs. Rhoda had a really interesting suggestion, and I don't know why it's never occurred to me before, because we've always been campaigning for central support from government, and there's a little bit of that around through High and various other places. But Rhoda made a really interesting suggestion, and one that I'm going to repeat today, and that is about taking money from the Rural and Island Housing Fund, because in the Rural and Islands Housing Plan through to over the next 5 years or so, there's there's £35 million has been put aside for housing. What if some of that was dedicated to revenue funding for community organisations? Whether you were able to allow them to employ a housing officer or a project officer for 2 years to enable them to successfully develop these projects, because we know they take time to develop. So if you just took 5 million of that 35 million budget in the Rural and Islands Housing Plan or out of the Rural and Islands Housing Fund and allowed community organisations to apply for it for core revenue funding, say you're paying somebody £30,000 a year for 2 years, you could have 70 development trusts or other community organisations with the capacity to start to practically design and deliver community housing projects. And that might help to overcome the lag that we have and the time that it takes communities to do this important work. And it takes time because they struggle with capacity. So that's my suggestion. As I say, not a new one, but I would like to see whether there's anything that could be squeezed out the Rural and Island Housing Fund, because we know that they are underspent. So if they're underspent on actually delivering housing, why can't we use it for revenue funding to help communities actually deliver the housing? Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Wendy. Absolutely. And I'm glad that we had that article by Rhoda Meek mentioned by you, because it is a really important contribution and it very much echoes the experiences I have in a population of, in Applecross, where we have a top population of 250 over a 26,000 hectare peninsula, and it's very, very difficult to find enough people to do all the jobs that are needed, voluntary and otherwise. It was also interesting to see mention of looking at the Rural and Island Housing Fund in terms of making that funding released a bit earlier in the new government's Rural and Islands Housing Action Plan. So it'll be interesting to see the details of that in terms of what that means. The next person who was scheduled to speak was Kate Hagman, but as I said, she is unfortunately not been available at the last minute. So we are now going to move on to the first of our artistic contributions. And this is a contribution from a poet, Lisa MacDonald, who's joining us from Akeltibui. Over to you, Lisa.
It says here that I can't start my own video. I don't know if I've been, oh, there we go. Can you see me okay now?
Yes, that's great. We have you. Thanks, okay. Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm actually joining you today from Ullapool Primary School, where I work. But I brought my book with me. And so this contribution comes from this wee book, Mrahan na Koigich. It's hard to see with the blurring. And then in English, it's on the back. It is The Woman of Coigach. And it's where I was imagining the very sometimes troubled history of the district, the parish of Coigach, from the famine years in the early 1800s. But I didn't want to just stop with the Napier Commission. I continued on thinking about the situation that families find themselves in current times. And I've tried to write it through the eyes of the woman, which is called why it's called The Woman of Coigach. And I've given each of the women a name and an age and a date at which this snapshot was taken. So this one here, I'm going to read it in Gaelic and then in English. This one is Kathy. She's 34, and the snapshot was taken in 2018. So if you can visualize that, and this is a story that's absolutely about rural housing. So I'm going to read you the Gaelic version first. Kimische vonunig finste and taien agoris, peace bug geniad mulch, san clavan crochtje ha ruintje na full glash. Gainje is buie blaas is mal hiswochnen tayanjo. Get this fatu ein surge, solus, and halu, trajan it ganebach ord, sne hard biantan ardan of eantoch. Chanaun leine and palches shin. Schanai sin Corumbi Bioan. Iarug mo fiwist mi ga hilmtrein gemod, a tjolda go horjachi. Leis nach al tuigaif riain, ha een skol vug chukaluchse vale ik hilmtrein truur geleeste org. De telem tuigam heen een jeran, voor hugorum svahuljarach, varam fasige glam. I'll read it in English now. Kathy. From my window I see the fence and the next house, a scrap of sky where the buzzard hangs low over fields at full glass. We who are here, we are lucky. These houses are warm and the rents are secure. In the distance are sunshine and freedom, the beaches, the poised, sure hills, and space. Not ours, this plenty. We may touch it and reach it, but live on it? No. My sister would bring home her family, but homes can't be found. I miss them. The falling school roll misses 3 bright young minds. Though I know I am lucky, I long for a place of my own, with blue and light and brown-black soil where my children can grow on the land. Tapalev, thank you.
Tapalev, Lisa, that was a beautiful poem. I particularly found those lines of it. My sister would bring home her family, but homes can't be found. I miss them. The falling school roll misses 3 bright young minds. It's such powerful words, and it's a really strong reminder that when we're talking about sustainable placemaking or affordable houses in remote rural communities like ours, this isn't some kind of technical planning tool or economic process. It's about communities and it's about families, and it's connected, like you said, to the much wider range of local services which are essential to make sure that our communities can continue to be viable, such as making sure that the primary schools remain open and the GP surgeries continue to be there. So thank you.
Because it's all cyclical. If those things
Absolutely.
aren't supported, and as soon as the school gets shut down, it's more difficult to attract young families into a district. And so everything is iterative. Everything has a knock-on effect on something else. What I should have possibly said, I explained that in the foreword, is that although the women themselves and the names I have given them and the dates are entirely fictional, the stories are nonetheless absolutely true. So these are things that people have told me.
Thank you. We're so lucky to have your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're now going to move on to the next poll. So this second poll asks you to tell us what your thoughts are in terms of the most important aspects of rural living for you. So we're asking you to pick your top 3 out of this list. And I know that's going to be hard. It's certainly going to be hard for myself, but please, if you'd like to have a go, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Okay, and while we are answering this poll, and to give Stephen a chance in the back room to help collate the answers for that, we're going to move on to the next panelist, who is Ewan McLaughlin from the Ascent Development Trust. Many of you know Ewan. He was one of the speakers at the first Building Rural Futures event. So it's really great to have you back, Ewan, and I'd like to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Megan. Okay, where do we start? We all know the challenges that our remote and rural communities, both north and south of the Central Belt, face. Challenges which have been compounded by almost every government's inability since the rent strikes and the land raids of the Highland Land League 140 years ago to see beyond those densely populated areas where the majority of their votes reside. But it's not been that way. Can I have the first slide, please? According to Webster's statistical account, in 1755, the Highlands had 51% of Scotland's population. 652,000 people lived and worked here compared to the Central Belt's 464,000. Today it's a bit different, 235,000 in the Highlands and 3.5 million folk in the Central Belt. The Highlands is 33% of Scotland's landmass and less than 5% of the population. Our rural communities have been mostly left behind by local, central and national governments to solve the housing crisis on their own. The task has fallen on the shoulders of development trusts and companies who are woefully understaffed, underfunded, and mostly run by older volunteers who are passionate about keeping their townships and villages alive. At best, their communities are only really qualified to be communities, a place where folk live, work and play, yet increasingly we're expected to be experts on planning, construction, design, tourism, engineering, statutory regulations, economic analysis, grant applications, and the cost that is match funding. The reality is responsibility has been abdicated to the lowest rung of civic society. I'm not going to beat up our local authorities. We all know their purses have been cut. Many of them are still suffering from the after effects of the greatest scam that the financial sector ever pulled off, PFI. Much of our problems grew out of the 2008 global financial crash when the money tree was stripped bare, well, except for the haves and have-mores whom governments supported in their attempts to restart the cycle of stupidity. I'll not mention COVID contracts. Our local authority is dependent on the Scottish Government, and the little talked about grant-aided expenditure, GAE, which determines how much each local authority can spend per head of population on things like roads, housing, education, health, utilities, and social well-being. The council tax we pay is just the cherry on the top. Unfortunately for local authorities, there hasn't been an increase in GAE since 2007 to 2008, the year of the global financial crash. Next slide, please. Highland Council, roughly the same size as Belgium, receives approximately £2,500 per head. Those fortunate enough to live in Orkney receive £4,000. In the Western Isles, it's £4,146, and in Shetland, a whopping £4,589, more than the £2,000 per head than those in the Highlands. Island communities also have SNP, the Scottish National Island Plan, which sets out how to repopulate and improve the lives of island communities across Scotland by considering how national policies will impact on island communities. That's great. It should always be that our Central Belt politicians are aware of the impact of their policies on the island communities. But what of those of us in the remote rural who don't risk getting our feet wet every time we try to travel? Our circumstances are almost identical to those in the islands. We're faced with depopulation, falling school rolls, fuel poverty, digital apartheid, laughable public transport, and of course, the housing crisis. But we have considerably less funds to tackle the same problems with. The solution is simple. COSLA and the Scottish Government need to look at increasing the £2,500 per head for the Highlands, not, I hasten to add, for the metropolis of Inverness. £1 spent there goes a lot further when you have a population density of 68 people per square kilometre than the northwest of Sutherland, where I share my square kilometre with just 1.2 people. It cannot be beyond the ken of our civil servants to work out a formula based on the year-round population of those postcodes from the beleaguered coastal townships that join people all the way up the west coast from Ulver Mull to Culhone, Mallaig, Kyle of Lacalsh, Loch Carron, Applecross, Gairloch, Pullew, Coigach, Aston, Scowry, Kinloch Vervey, Durness, Talmine, Tongue and Betty Hill. You might not recognise some of these names, but you'd probably recognise Instagram photographs of them. Give those communities parity with their island counterparts, and pretty soon services will improve. Infrastructure repairs spotted and repaired early on won't lead to centralised situations where a not fit for purpose small car park and a North Coast 500 tourist sweet spot costs over £1 million of public money. There needs to be a profound reset in the way rural Scotland is funded and allowed to grow. I recently had a light bulb moment when I listened to an academic webinar organised by the James Hutton Institute discussing Scotland and Japan and how to counteract rural to urban flow. I was the point of dropping off when Luke Dilly from Akita International University mentioned something that had me sit upright. In 2008, the Japanese government introduced Furusato no Zai, also known as the hometown tax. It was launched as an attempt to support regional rural areas facing shrinking tax revenues due to depopulation. It provides a way to financially support the hometowns of those who have moved to urban areas or cities to pay taxes to the area where they grew up. We know the situation well. Our kids leave for education and jobs. By their child-rearing years, they're ready to come back. But alas and alack, houses have either been snapped up by Airbnb prospectors, or are priced far beyond the mortgage their salaries might allow. Japanese taxpayers who contribute more than 2,000 yen, that's roughly £11, can have their income tax and residence tax reduced. The more you donate, the greater the refund. So imagine for a moment where our young rural diaspora are living their best lives in urban UK, can contribute a part of their tax to supporting their home township and help build attainable homes that they might one day come home to. The second part of this radical Japanese thinking is Kanki Jinko, which is a reimagining and expansion of what community is, that allows those who perhaps have no real connection to a rural area, but have a heritable interest or an affinity for it, who visit, who buy local products, who want to live there to also donate and receive a tax fund. Those people give an energy to the rural when they visit. A slide here from Boyd Alexander, who's our Sutherland Resettlement Officer. His slide, he identified land for houses that Highland Council were not always aware they actually owned. We actually have roughly 100 houses in development between Coyoch and Betty Hill at the moment. Can you imagine the impact Kanki Jinko donations from Scotland's global diaspora of between 28 to 40 million people could have on the financial costs of infrastructure and building of the 100 homes or so those community-led housing developments in our remote rural areas have started working on? The annual total donations towards the hometown tax in Japan in the last financial year was 830 billion yen. That's £4.5 billion. Compare that to the 8 billion yen, that's 40 million pounds, they received in, when was it? Oh yeah, 15 years ago, at the time of global financial crash. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ewan, and thanks for bringing in some international experience. I think it's really good to remind ourselves to lift our head up from the detail of what we're trying to do in Scotland and see what can be learned from other countries and how they're doing it more successfully. And certainly when we're thinking about £4.5 billion worth of money being raised through this kind of tax, whether it's through a hometown tax or the Kanki Jinku, I think you said, the tax for those who have a connection with a place. That certainly sounds like the kind of imaginative thinking we need to think about here in Scotland in terms of how we can make sure we have, good quality, energy efficient, well-designed homes in the places that people need them, in the places where they are the most expensive to build because of the scale at which they're being built. So that's a really, really interesting contribution. And I can see from the comments, there's been a lot of responses to that as well. So Stephen, can we go to the results from the second poll? Okay, so here we are. What are the most important aspects of rural living for you? And I saw there was quite a lot of people commenting that having to choose 3 out of this list of 10 was really, really difficult. And I share your pain on that. But let me see. Well, unsurprisingly, the answer which got the biggest proportion of your votes was affordable homes with 60%, followed closely by an active local community at 55%. And then I think good broadband connection at 46%, employment and entrepreneurial opportunities at 43%, and then many of the others got a good response rate. Interestingly, no one chose living within 30 minutes drive of an urban centre is one area that people value in terms of an aspect of rural living, which is interesting in itself, in terms of the desire clearly maybe among some of you that you have what you need close to hand and don't want to be taking long journeys into town centres. So we are now going to move on to a slightly different, we've heard from Wendy and Ewan focusing in on the role of affordable housing and the work that community groups and community-led affordable housing is, the importance of that within their work. We're now going to hear from Polly Chapman from the Impact Hub Inverness. Sorry, Paul, I'm struggling over these words. Who's going to talk a little bit now about a slightly different part of what sustainable placemaking and building rural futures is all about. Over to you, Polly.
Thanks very much, Megan. Yeah, I want to talk about rural hubs, co-working spaces office spaces, but with a bit of extra twist to them. And it's really building on this idea of the 20-minute neighborhood, which is a big policy push at the moment. So you can access the kind of some key services within 20 minutes within your neighborhood, not needing to go 30 minutes to an urban centre. But before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on something that Ewan mentioned about community groups having to be experts and everything, and the difficulty that you can have in accessing the skills and so on to drive forward a lot of these projects. And was to really do a plug for something called Just Enterprise, which is a Scottish Government contract specifically targeted at social enterprises, community trusts and so on, to bring some additional skills and resources into those organisations to help with business planning and a lot of the other skills and things. And it basically brings extra pair of hands into your community for a number of days. So justenterprise.org. And that was not what I was here to talk about though, so, but it was too good an opportunity. But basically, yes, co-working spaces, they have been part of the urban landscape for quite a long time. But increasingly we're finding them in rural areas, and Impact Hub Inverness is one. I know Inverness is not rural in the sort of rural scheme of things, but it's the first Impact Hub, which is a global network that's not in a mega city, and it shows that increasingly in the smaller communities than the likes of London and Birmingham and so on, that you can have these co-working spaces, and they're really important for providing work and business opportunities, particularly post-COVID. And we're seeing an increase in rural hubs across the Highlands and Islands that I'm aware of, in very small communities. Egg is one I'll talk about later on. You know, it's not just the towns in the area. There's somewhere that home or hybrid workers can go, but they also offer the potential to stimulate rural entrepreneurship, making it easier for people to start their own businesses in a rural setting, and it kind of gives a platform for those entrepreneurs that are there. Don't need to share any screen, or you can. Okay, it's fine. But it gives access to relatively low cost office space. You're not paying for a whole office; you're just paying for a desk. But it also enables an enterprise and community to grow up in that community and to sort of get established. It gives up business to business opportunities, informal business support, and it reduces social isolation. So there's a lot of other pluses other than just the desk that you might be renting. And it's also an important way of providing high quality, high speed broadband without the necessity to provide infrastructure to every house. That is the ideal, but after decades of trying to achieve that, it's not happened. And this is a way of providing that high quality service without having to live in an urban area. Having said that, my own Wi-Fi in Inverness is pretty ropey. But a community co-working space in a rural area has to have a lot more than just the co-working element in order to be viable. Even in Inverness, we don't just do the co-working. It wouldn't be viable without it, without other things. But in a rural community, it can be the place where you provide a lot of really other important services. So the cafe, the shop, the post office, the laundrette, the gym, the soft play area, childcare facilities. These are all examples from across rural Highlands and Islands of additional services that happen in co-working spaces. And there's a benefit of having these additional things. It brings increased footfall to all of the facilities on offer, somewhere to go and work and get your washing done, or to childcare and so on. So the multiple use of buildings is a way of bringing new life to existing buildings that are underutilized, such as a village or a community hall that might not be used during the day. This was a former wood burning stove outlet that was just empty. So this is Greenbrae in Hopeman. So it brings new uses, and it helps the community to provide a whole plethora of services. And they're important for all of these services, including the co-working, are important for the retention of population, but increasingly for attracting new people to live in the communities and bring new skills, which you don't want to put pressure on existing housing, but it's a way of helping to build that community and sustain it in the longer term. And so my question really is, should the provision of such a space be built into the planning of new house construction? Is there an option to use Section 75 agreements to look at providing these services in the community, not just the co-working, but enabling you to provide a whole range of other services in your community? And there were 3 examples there. We're on the Isle of Egg one at the moment. Obviously a very small community of around about 100, but by using the space to provide a whole range of things, that local shop, craft shop, tea room, post office, toilet and shower facilities, ferry terminal waiting room, offices for the trust, but also a small co-working space as part of it. It makes all of those individual bits of the business more viable, and gives a really important opportunity to other people. If you can just skip back to the Hopeman one, please. I don't know who's in charge of slides. So yeah, Hopeman, again, a small community, not as small as Egg, but it's a co-working space, therapy rooms, event hire. They're looking at micro wedding venue, because it's another revenue stream. But a really big part of it is about having the business breakfast and the monthly meetups for local businesses to reduce social isolation and to help that business to business contracting and collaboration. And they also do training, they do craft sessions, they do wellness retreats, anything that they can think of that brings additional people in, provides additional services and additional revenue streams. And sorry, if you can just flick back again to the Inverness one, which I know is an Inverness. No, other way, yeah. So co-working space. Oh, it's jumping all over the place. We're a co-working space venue hire, but we also there's quite a lot of, we have a lot of members in our Impact Hub in Inverness, and there's a lot of business to business collaboration, joint bidding for contracts and so on. And people come from probably around 30 minutes cycle drive of Inverness from the rural areas to use the space because of the broadband that we have. And there's a lot of, it's a hosted community, so there's a lot of top member events, and we actively link businesses to each other, and we provide informal business advice just because that's our actual core business. So you tend to get a lot more than just a desk. So I think looking at ways that these models can be built within the community using the planning legislation would be an interesting way to explore. And I hope I'm within my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Polly. That was perfectly on time. And I think that's a really, really interesting provocation, thinking about how we use planning and planning regulations and planning obligations, such as Section 75 services, to be delivering these broader priorities and needs for communities through existing development projects. We're going to move straight on to the next panellist, who is Ariane Burgess, our member of the Scottish Parliament. Over to you, Ariane.
Thanks, Megan. Good evening. I'm sitting, I realised I should have turned a light on because it's beginning to get dark. So if it starts to go dark, apologies. Yeah, so I was here actually on the first SEDA Land of this series, and that was fantastic. And there I was introducing the idea of transforming all of our villages and towns and neighbourhoods into ecological towns, villages, neighbourhoods, and by looking at the social, economic, which is what Polly's referring to there, cultural and the ecological element, and within the ecological element, the housing, the critical housing bit, which is kind of our one of our focus today. And I think it's really great timing that the Scottish Parliament have lined up the debate on, actually it was the government, have lined up the debate tomorrow on the Rural Island Housing and Action Plan that just came out on the 13th of October. So that's tomorrow afternoon. So tune in for that and to see what we discuss in the chamber and what we can draw out from the Housing Minister. So one of the things that I have been really supporting strongly since I have been in this role, and also as part of the cooperation agreement, is the idea of community-led housing. And I completely and 100% take on board Wendy's provocation around, well, should it really be communities that are all volunteer-based? And I think it is something we certainly need to be looking into. But so through the Butte House Agreement, we negotiated to get funding support to what's called community housing trusts or enablers. And there are 2 in Scotland, Community Housing Trust, Communities Housing Trust, which is works in the Highlands and Islands area, and then South of Scotland Community Housing. And now there's going to be funding support for them to work with communities to go through all of the different options, all of the tenures, all of the different partnering kinds of ways that they could be going through. And I think that's tremendous that resource is there, because we are committed to building 11,000 houses, obviously not enough, but we are committed to building 11,000 houses by 2030 or 32. And where's the pipeline? Where's the confidence and capacity building for communities going to come from? So it's great that we've got that resource. But one of the things there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The main one I wanted to talk about today is something that's come across my desk, and it's not originally for me. It's coming from the work of Bernard Planterose and Karen Grant, who are both connected in different ways to Reforesting Scotland. And the idea is microhousing. And I love this idea because I think it's a way that we could very quickly get really good quality housing for people to come back to communities, to keep that school role, to provide the skills and work for hospitality. I mean, every business I hear from crying out for people to be able to come and work in their business in every sector. So I think microhousing is a way forward, but the challenge there is that we have domestic business building standards that require us to build within certain standards. And so there's a number of barriers there. And some of the standards include the space standards. So there's a requirement for the space to be 30 square meters. I think it's a requirement for you to be able to move in a space with 3 square meters around you, for example. Do we really need that? So I just want to be clear, the kind of housing I'm talking about is for people who would be coming or already living in a community that are of working age, and are going to be going out and being physically active and all those kinds of things. So the other question would be, do we really need the access arrangements that are needed for other types of housing? And I totally I'm 100% behind, and I'm not talking about any kind of deregulation here. I think we absolutely need good quality housing that is accessible, but we need to start looking at housing that is for a specific purpose. So we could be looking at access arrangements. Again, when you're talking about building micro housing, discussions I've had with Bernard and Karen, they're pointing out, well, do we need such high insulation standards? When you've got much smaller footprint of dwelling space, then you can actually keep that much more cozy, much more easily. And also the energy performance standards, that that's questionable because of what they're based on. They're based on, from what I understand, a semi-detached house in Milton Keynes or something. So again, something that needs to be reviewed. Also, structural engineering standards. Again, in micro housing, you're not going to be having huge big spans and needing kind of massive, kind of concerning structural infrastructure. Also, ventilation and air tightness. And bear with me, I know I'm getting technical but this is the thing. Getting technical, I have realized, is what we really need to do. We need to get under the hood of the regulations that create the barriers for us to be doing things. So ventilation and air tightness, maybe there are different technologies and requirements that would be appropriate for micro dwellings. Mechanical ventilation and heat recovery systems and air tightness may not be what the people who want to come and live in those houses are, because I'm kind of imagining that a lot of the people who would like to live in micro housing are people who actually want to be out in nature, helping us do all that work to do nature restoration and biodiversity. And again, another piece around waste treatment is, should we be looking at better recognition of composting systems? I've certainly had experience with some very good, quite posh composting systems out there nowadays. So those are the things that I think we could be looking at, and I certainly will be taking that to the housing minister and also to Patrick Harvey, who oversees building regulations, and having that discussion with him, because we absolutely need, as we're here all today discussing, urgent intervention in it. But I really want to be clear that this is not about deregulation or lowering the standards. It's about facilitating a much needed outcome, which is less expensive and better designed starter homes. And that is my provocation. I think we really need to be looking at this opportunity. And I remember quite some years ago under the name tiny homes, and I think this is similar but different. Tiny homes seems to have a bit more of a kind of mobility thing, whereas we're moving around, whereas this really would be homes in place that you could, I would hope that you could get a mortgage for. But I also think part of the conversation I'll be having with people is actually talking to businesses and seeing if they would be willing to get behind these and actually fund them.
Thanks, Ariane. I think you've touched on one of the most important questions, I think, about the future of affordable housing in remote rural community areas, is this: how do we find how do we reduce costs without compromising on space or quality and design? And I hesitate to suggest to Gail and the SEDA team that this might merit its own entire panel, but I think a panel that would be able to get down into the nitty-gritty detail in terms of what this means from the regulatory framework and what it means for planning would be really, really important in terms of moving this forward. So it's great to hear that you're having active conversations with Patrick Harvey and other ministers and people within the government about how to move this forward. So we are now going to move on to the third poll for you all. And this is a poll asking whether or not large landowners should be legally obliged to offer small areas of land adjacent to communities at affordable prices. And this is particularly thinking about land that would be suitable for affordable housing in areas where it's a demonstrated need. So if you would all like to take as many of the answers of this for yourself, thanks. And while we are all doing that and giving Stephen a chance to collate the answers, I'd like to firstly remind you to please put your questions into the chat box so that we have a good pool from which we can start the Q&A session afterwards. And then I'm going to hand over to Chris Morgan from John Gilbert Architects. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I do have slides, Megan, so I hope somebody can organise that.
Yes, I'm sure. Here we are. It just looks like they're coming up right now.
Just go one up, please. Yeah, that's it. The one you're clicking on. Okay, so I suspect that everybody would imagine I would talk about sort of energy efficiency and natural materials and architectural things, but I thought luckily Ariane's done that for me, so that's okay. But I thought if I had 5 minutes to talk about what would help communities, I think the design aspect is important, but I would say 90% of the issue is what lies behind the scenes. So I'm going to go off-piste. I'm going to go into places where I'm not an expert, but I hope that in terms of just offering provocations, it's more useful, it's more practical to mention some of the things that we've seen. So we do a lot of community-led housing, and we keep seeing things that strike us as daft and would be better if we could, we could change the system around it. The housing here is at Glentrool in Dumfries and Galloway. The inset picture is the old school building, which was empty and has been turned into a community facility. And as part, what's interesting about the project, as part of it, we also were able to help with refurbishing 3 empty properties in the village, which were also transferred to the community. So the community now owns both the community centre and 3 homes, and there is a degree of financial cross-fertilisation, which I think is incredibly helpful, although I don't understand all of it. But the number one, or the first point I wanted to make, and again, I think Ariane has got there before me a little bit, but it seems obvious to us that it would make sense to have a considerably enlarged and empowered community housing trusts. There are 2, we work with them both, but it seems to me that there could be much more, either bigger or more of them. And my contention would be that these much more empowered trusts would support communities in developing the funding part, which they do now. I think it would be incredibly helpful if they had money to purchase assets before community groups have time to get all things organized. Often what we find is that somebody wants to sell an asset, it would be incredibly useful for community to have, but it'll take years for the community to get its act together collectively, and in the meantime the seller just says, well, I've sold it on to somebody who I know can develop it quickly. And so having the capacity to buy things and hold them, if it's broadly seen to be in the community good or in the public good, seems to me a useful function for somebody to have. I think it would be useful for these trusts to be able to support communities through the design and the build process. And I note that in some of the projects we've been working on, that will only happen if the project goes direct to design and build, rather than being led by the architectural process. And if we're interested in quality, and a lot of the things that probably most of the people in this audience would be interested in, quality, natural materials, local resources, and so on and so forth, flexibility, I think the idea that you don't support the architectural process, you just go straight to design and build, I think could be problematic, but not necessarily. And the other thing I think would be useful would be for these trusts to be able to support communities and work with communities in the operational phase. So in other words, what I'm saying is that they could operate a bit like registered social landlords, but they could work with communities. It could community led. You don't get into the situation that the community owns the land or the property, but the RSL has to then use its own internal mechanisms to work out who goes to stay in the houses and so on and so forth. So my sense is that a much enlarged and much more empowered and more sort of engaged community housing trust or trusts would be an incredibly helpful thing for people to do. And it's nice to hear Ariane say that there's more money going into that. I just assume that there could be more. So that's first sort of set of provocations. Yes, well, and the other thing is that they would attract funding in the same way that an RSL. So if you want to build 3 houses, the community trust would be able to act as that sort of agent and so on and so forth. And I know it doesn't exist now, all of this, but it could. That's the point. Next slide. The other thing I forgot to say is that in my head, there are sort of 3 ways of going forward with community housing. One is what we've talked about mostly, which is this business of affordable housing, and the previous slides were an example of that. To me, there are 3. There's a sort of affordable housing model of some description. There's, in my head, an able to pay model, which is where people who do have enough money do something. And then there's also the sort of economic development model, where you have businesses locally that say, look, we desperately need housing, we're prepared to support it in some way. So there are 3 sort of separate funding routes, maybe, or separate funding types of way forward. Anyway, the second one is this able to pay, which has been talked about already. Jono Hines talked about it, I think, at the last session, but essentially co-housing. And we've done a fair few co-housing projects over the years. The main picture is the one in Fintorn that some people may be familiar with. And the one in the top left is something that I'm desperately hoping will happen, which is at Comrie Croft. And there are other projects too that we've been involved in. Clacken was an urban one that has just stopped, but we were working on that. And I think everybody understands the benefits of this. You take out the developers, or you broadly bypass the developers, and you become your own developers, but you share the risks. But I think an awful lot of people could and would want to do that. But what's interesting for me about able to pay, about co-housing, is that in other countries, and I'm thinking of Holland in particular, if we're interested in an international perspective, Holland goes to some lengths, or the Netherlands go to some length to support co-housing, because primarily what they see is a huge benefit to social care. So they see elderly people, particularly who are the able to pay in many cases, being able to have better mental health, better social structure, shared structure, reduced costs, and all of the things that we would all probably say are good things. So in the Netherlands particularly, it's a social care exercise, which the Dutch government then go to some trouble to subsidize and support, because they see that benefit. And I think this is incredibly important. And I grew up in a hippie commune, so I obviously think this is a good idea. But I think most of us see that it's not just about technology, it's about social structures and about people and about how we organize ourselves. So to me, this is a fairly sensible thing to do, particularly for the mental health benefits. The last slide, please. The main picture is a passive house, community-led development down in Dumfries and Galloway, which I felt I ought to show you. But the two pictures on the top, one is up in the Highlands and is a derelict couple of cottages, which we are working with a commercial organisation to develop for housing for them, because they struggle to get people to stay. So we are looking to both refurbish the existing cottages and build new sort of eco cottages, all off-grid, to fundamentally to support their business, because they can't get staff to stay. And broadly speaking, a similar aspiration on the picture in the middle top, which is in Braemar, which is affordable housing community led. But the impetus for a lot of that was the fact that the hotels in Braemar simply, well, they really struggled to keep their staff. And so they were very supportive of something which would enable affordable housing in the village, basically. And as everybody knows, Braemar is not, it's all second homes and so on, and inexpensive homes. So, but I wanted to go even further off piste with this slide, and just to say there are some other ideas which I think are sensible. Ariane talked about sort of micro homes, and we've done some of the work has been done with this in the hutting movement and exercise, which Bernard and I were involved in, and Bernard's involved in the micro housing as well. But I was involved years ago internationally in a thing called core homes, where what you provided was that the core facilities, so it wasn't so much about a small building, it was about a basic set of facilities, and the idea was that you were therefore essentially safe and able to live, but it was assumed that you would then start to build and develop according to your resources and means. And I have often been involved in projects where we talked about sweat equity, which is a stupid name, but fundamentally the same principle, which is that you say not everybody has lots of money, but they have skills and time. And if we're looking at shifting the emphasis away from centralized ideas about what people should do to people's own ideas about what they should do, then the idea of providing a core set of functions which you can adjust to suit your enthusiasm and energy is, to me, is a really nice idea. Nobody's mentioned it yet, but I presume everybody has a thing about empty homes and second homes. And I did some research on this and looked at the numbers, that, broadly speaking, the number of empty homes, the number of second homes is comparable to the number of homes we're supposed to be building for people. And I would have thought, if, as Wendy said right at the beginning, homes are a sort of key to the well-being agenda for Scottish Government, and well, for all of us here, then surely we should do something more serious about the sort of fiscal and financial things that I don't understand that you can do to make these things happen. Surely it can be encouraging for people. And the same principle with single occupancy homes in relation to social care. I think that would be something that would be worth looking into more. Sorry, I've obviously gone over my time. I apologise.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad you brought up this question of the existing housing stock. Here in Applecross, we have 45% of our housing stock on the peninsula is second homes and short-term lets. And if we think about what the local population would mean if we had all those houses fully occupied all the time, it would be a very, very different community. So we're now going to go and have a look at the results of the polls from that. So the question was, should larger landowners be legally obliged to offer small areas of land adjacent to communities at affordable prices? 70% of people said this should be happening if it's in the public interest and if it has community support, which clearly indicates the fact that you need the demand for this to be happening. And then there was support in general for it to be happening in all cases as well, and also on the condition of planning permission and it being something which is triggered when the land changes hands. So we are now we've come to the end of our panelists, so thank you all for your contributions. We'll have a chance to ask them questions shortly, but before we move on to the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce our second artistic contribution, who is from the poet Pauline Pryor-Pitt, who's based in North Uist. So Pauline, would you like to join us?
Yep. Yes, I don't know you can't see me, can you?
No, we can see you.
Oh, you can? Oh, that's fine. Lovely. I moved to North Uist about 25 years ago, and the friends and relatives in England thought I was absolutely mad. And they used to phone up and ask me questions about where we were living, because they thought it would be really wild. And this poem, you don't hear the questions that they're asking me, you just hear my answers. Telephone call. Of course there's running water. Yes, cold and hot, and electricity, and heating, not main drainage, no, but we've a septic tank, and to be frank, we've had no trouble. Lonely? Only if you want to be. Not far from the sea. Stunning. Deserted beaches, silver shell sand, turquoise indigo seas, distant purple headlands. Oh, very friendly indeed. There's a co-op nearby. You can get everything you need. Well, fresh pasta, fajitas, fruit, veg, live yogurt, the usual supermarket food. Lorries arrive 3 times a week. The quality of everything is very good. Yes, it is quiet. So quiet you can hear the beat of a seagull's wing. No, I can't really say that I miss anything. Absolutely pitch black at night. The stars are so bright. Yes, sometimes in the winter, northern lights. Single track with passing places. Everyone waves, no one races. Well, that's not quite true. Some people do. Gales. Oh, very strong. Stronger than anything I've ever known. But I've grown used to them. Don't like to go out on my own in case I get blown away. It's never too hot. But in July and August, brave swimmers swim a lot. I do on sunny days when the tide comes in across warm sand bays. Plenty of places, hills, moors, beaches for walking, and there's canoeing and fishing if that's what you're wanting. Wellingtons, walking boots, scarf, hat, waterproof gear, and shorts and bathing things. In one day, we can have all the seasons of the year. Yes, you must. Do come. I'm sure you love it here.
Thank you, Pauline. That really reminds me of conversations I have with friends in other parts of the world who have never been to Applecross and can't imagine what it's like living in such a place, or what it was like growing up on the Isle of Skye. Thank you. That's a really lovely poem. We're now going to move on to the next part of this afternoon's conversation. So a reminder while we do this, to put your questions in the chat box for when we start the Q&A session. And if I could ask all the panelists, please, to put their videos on. This is a chance for the 6 of us to have a bit of a conversation and respond to some of the provocations that we've all given. And before we start, though, I just want to read out the provocation that Kate Hagman sent prior to this this afternoon's event. So she works with Dumfries and Galloway Council, and one of her provocation had 2 parts to it. One was around the need for greater integration and the breaking down of silos between local government and within local government and with other stakeholders, as well as the need for better understanding of social value within planning departments and developers. And for those of you who are interested in what that means in practice, quite a lot of the second Building Rural Futures conversation related to social value. So there's a lot of discussion in there. And though I'm sure some of the other panelists will have a view on that this afternoon. So I wanted to start by asking you all a question about what's needed. We've heard a lot from all of you, and there were lots of ideas in the question and answers about various challenges that community groups are facing, trying to deliver both affordable housing and sort of community enterprise hubs, like Polly mentioned. What would your one suggested change in policy be? And this can either be a new policy, or it can be actually the removal of an existing policy, which is providing an inadvertent barrier to communities to be able to do this. So I'd like to go around all of you to answer this question. And while I'm doing that, at the end of your answer, if you have any particular questions which you'd like to then ask one of the other panelists, something burning from their provocation, if you can add that at the end, that would be great. So I'm going to start in the opposite direction, I'm afraid, Chris, by putting you on the spot to know what your kind of key change in policy would be.
That's tricky because I don't know enough about it. I mean, you know, I do the architecture bit less, and I was very conscious of moving into areas I'm less keen on. But two things occur to me. One is that when you look into why it's so difficult to get this done, there are really lots of reasons. Like, we keep coming across them. And what I don't fully understand, and is probably a provocation to everybody, is if we all see that it's important, and if we all see that it's difficult, why haven't we fixed it by now? Because there really are an awful lot of problems that seem to come and bite people. You know, projects that we thought were going to happen, but they were sold to a developer, projects that can't get the money because they don't like the procurement route that the community have chosen, you know, insufficient support for people, volunteers who run out of steam. I mean, there's an awful lot of ways that these things can go wrong, and I would have thought that many of these things could have been fixed by now. The other question I've got, and it relates to other work that we're doing, which is that this is phrase multi-solving. If you think that housing solves lots of problems, which I think we do, then it would be interesting to see how it could be funded, acknowledging that it deals with lots of other issues. It's not just you know, it's a housing funding, but the housing brings benefits beyond just housing. So that would be you're talking about silos and so on. I mean, we talk about that a lot. You know, how could we manage finance to say, given that something we're going to do ticks a lot of different boxes, could it be financed from a lot of different boxes?
That's a really great response, Chris. And I wasn't putting you on the spot because I'm expecting any of you to be policy
under
experts.
pressure as well,
just,
Megan.
I'm trying. I'm just thinking ahead to the next Building World Futures event, and the last one of this particular series is going to be looking at the role of the Scottish Government and what kind of policy and government level response is needed. So I think it's good to start building up some ideas and suggestions to pass on to whoever's chairing that next event. Ariane, would you like to go next?
Help if I turn on my microphone. What am I going to say? I'm going to say micro-housing. I mean, I've been busy with this for a long time. And Chris, I actually worked on, I was on the other side of the East Winds co-housing project in Findhorn. So it gave me a lot of food for thought going through that project. And I actually think there's something in the mix there around micro-housing and the co-housing model and combining those two things. And actually, I'm going to maybe ask you a question about that. So that's what I would think. But I'm also actually delighted that you are pointing to the need for more community housing trusts, because I was at the Community Housing Trust, the Highland and Island one, their AGM, and there was a woman from rural Perthshire, I think, there, kind of beggingly asking for help because, you know, they don't have anything kind of in the middle, and CHT is helping them out. But you're right. I think we need more of those organizations. And Communities Housing Trust used to be called Highland Small Communities Housing Trust. They've changed their name so that they can, you know, reach out and help people. In Orkney, they're already doing that kind of thing. So yeah, but to you, Chris, I wonder what your thoughts are, and if you've got a reflection on having been involved in the East Winds co-housing project, you know, what your thoughts are around the size of the houses and flats that were built there. I have some concern about that because there's shared facilities, and my sense is the design of co-housing really needs to encourage people to share more. And I do think the building, and I think in general, we need to be sharing more, and the built environment can help us do that.
Thanks, Ariane. If we can just hold that question, Chris, and we'll see what the other panelists would like to say about policy changes, and I'll come back to you. Polly, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'm no expert on the detail of housing policy these days. I'm very rusty, but there's a few things that are kind of coming to my mind, based on things that I've seen happening. So in Harris, I know that they were looking at trying not to provide housing by providing houses, but looking at alternative ways of providing housing. So looking at the ship option that they have in Shetland for people move, for migrant workers that they desperately need in order to function, particularly in the tourist season. Looking at modular houses that were not going to have sort of long-term lifespans, but it was a way of providing starter accommodation, very small accommodation, quite easily, that would then enable people to get settled and develop a sort of a place in the community and so on. So they were looking at different models of providing housing that weren't about houses. So I think that's one that's not a policy thing necessarily. Someone else has mentioned empty homes and bringing them back into use. And I don't know what the blockage there is. I think it's a funding block as far as I'm aware, but I don't know the detail. But just picking up on what Chris was saying, there was a lot of work done 15, 20 years ago on the link between housing and economic development. And the housing, Community Scotland, as it was then, that was responsible for housing, was putting money into economic development projects because of as well as housing, to try and bring those two things together. So that kind of cross silo, looking at how you can, recognizing the link between the two. And I know Hands and Lands Enterprise has looked at this quite a lot, because housing has to sit alongside their economic development activities as well. So trying to break out of those silos a bit. Health services can't function in places like Skye because there's no housing. So trying to bring Labourage in funding from different sources. Sorry, it's not groundbreaking.
No, but I think, thanks, Paula. I mean, I think it really builds on that, such an important point that Chris made about recognising that housing is not just about building new homes or getting more people. It's not simply about addressing depopulation, but it's also about the very substantial, much wider social, economic, health, well-being, infrastructure benefits that can come from that. We're not very good at thinking about the cumulative benefit of the cumulative value of all the different community-led housing projects, and we're also not very good at looking at the cumulative impact of what all those what the wider economic impact and well-being impact that those projects will have in the long run. Ewan, do you want to talk? Have you got any suggestions around a single change in policy that you see would make a difference?
Good ideas mean nothing without the backing of proper policy. And I don't feel we're seeing it. I feel there's this great disconnect between the problems we're facing in the rural, the remote rural, not just in the Highlands, not just down the West Coast, but also in Dumfries and Galloway and the borders. We're far too concentrated in the Central Belt and the concerns of that massive area where we've got 3.5 million people living in an area that stretches from my house to Thurso. It's not a huge area, but all rammed in sort of thing. I think we have to start looking at our local authorities and ask why they are the gatekeepers for community-led development. Why so many things in planning, for example, just don't get the go-ahead. Empty homes have been mentioned, and I agree. I think there's a huge amount of empty homes here, but there's also that aspect that so many of them are not fit for purpose. The insulation is rotten, structurally they're not that great. You know, it's getting to the stage where it's cheaper to build a new rather than, you know, refurbish, you know, restore sort of thing. I think, you know, my two provocations were about grant aided expenditure. I think it's not beyond the ken of our government and COSLA and local authorities to sit down and try and work out a way to help the communities that are most at risk, the rural communities that are just really struggling. I mean, I love what Wendy was saying about this idea from Rhoda Meek about the Islands Fund, you know, just to actually support the volunteers, the underfunded staff, the development trust without any form of community benefit to actually make their communities sustainable. I mean, you and I talk about this a lot, Megan, and we know that the difficulties, it's just, you feel as if you're right at the end of your tether with it, because we have these conversations, we float these ideas, we look at innovative ways that it works abroad, and then we come back 6 months later and talk about the same things again. We need some real active change from government, right down to the local level, down to the community council level, where we don't have situations where a cattle grid that would cost 50 quid to repair 4 years ago is now costing tens of thousands to repair. You know, so there needs to be funding brought right down and move away from this hideous centralisation that we seem to be getting swallowed up in. There you go.
Thank you. The other reason, of course, that I think it's very timely that we're able to have this discussion is because, as Ariane already said, and I had mentioned, we have this new Rural and Islands Housing Action Plan. There's a whole section on efforts to support community-led development. There's a whole section on the role of local authorities and local government and other elements. There's a discussion in Parliament tomorrow afternoon. So there's plenty of chance to raise these discussions and think about what the recommended actions in that action plan mean, what's missing, what else needs to be done. Clearly, finance is, from all of what you've been saying, a really important part of that, and the need to finance additional resources and support within communities and from external groups to communities. Wendy, what would you like to say anything about sort of key changes in policy?
Yeah, I've got a few. I mean, first of all, I'd like to support what Chris said at the beginning, which is about that whole silo issue. So, you know, we talk about housing in isolation. Well, the government seems to talk about housing in isolation or it has a policy of it in isolation. It talks about it in other strategies in relation to repopulation and all sorts of other things. But when you as a community come to do a housing project, it's not evaluated in that wider context, and none of the kind of other policies seem to be able to impact on your ability or the evaluation of the project and the reason about whether it's cost effective to do your project. It's seen purely in housing terms and the value of the house or the cost of the house that you're putting up and the number of people that might live in it. So I would completely agree with Chris that there's that broader issue. On a more practical level, there were two things that occurred to me. One is procurement policy. For small communities, having to go through public procurement for these projects means that local companies, small local tradespeople cannot get into delivery of housing projects at a local level. So the economic benefit to your local area is missed because the money generally goes out, or the tender generally is won by a larger contractor who brings people into the area, has additional costs for doing that to the project because they then have to find housing and accommodation, funnily enough, and various other things. So there's an issue about the whole procurement process and the requirement to go through this national process that disadvantages small communities doing it. And the other one, picking up somebody's point about existing housing stock, and I know this is a national issue as opposed to a Scottish government issue, but the other thing is actually the cost of refurbishing houses is severely affected by the fact that you have to pay VAT on materials and any you have to pay VAT, whereas new build is VAT exempt. So for any community doing a refurbishment, you're immediately at a disadvantage when you're looking at value for money criteria, because your costs are going to have to include an extra 20%, not across the board, because some things are 5% VAT rated, but it adds a significant amount of money to the cost of doing your project, which when your projects go to the Rural and Island Housing Fund for evaluation, they'll take a view on whether it's seen to be cost effective or not, and it's good value for money. So two very practical things, as well as that broader issue about joined up policy.
Thanks, Wendy. Those are exactly the kind of, I think, practical barriers and challenges that I think we need to, it's good to collate at this stage to be able to carry forward in the conversation. Chris, did you want to respond to Ariane's question about
yes, except I got drawn into thinking about other things and I need to get my brain back. But culturally, we don't like to do less, right? You know, could we have less stuff? Could we eat less food? Could we consume more resources? I think as a culture, we're not very good at that. We always think, well, more, but like better, so that'll be okay, you know. So there's something fundamental I like about smaller housing, because it's an acknowledgement that we don't actually need nearly as much stuff as we seem to think we do. So that's nice. Fundamentally, it's a good thing, I think. However, it's entirely possible for it to be abused, so that, you know, like most things, you can use them badly or well. I mean, you can, almost anything can be used badly or well, and small housing is one of those things, I would imagine. But the reason I haven't said micro housing, even though I can see the point of it in some cases, is that the core housing idea, what's implicit in that is it's not a bunch of space. It's a set of facilities that you need. You know, you need toilets and you need bathrooms and you need, you know, sort of sanitary things and so on. But the assumption in a core house, or at least the idea, is that there's opportunity for change, whereas the assumption in micro housing is that it's all pre-designed by a genius architect, usually, who will sort of preempt everything that you could ever think of in the future. And to me, that's another example of taking the community control away and putting it into the architect, someone like me who thinks they're very clever, you know. And I think it's nicer to say, well, why don't you provide the facilities and allow people to start doing their own things?
Thanks, Chris. I'm afraid I do believe this is something that SEDA should consider organising a whole separate event on, and I'm seeing some nodding, because we have run out of time in our panel discussion session. And before we move on to the Q&A, we're now going to hear some music from Corinne Polwart. We're going to hear Salters Road now. Thank you.
Well, I can say there's many things I wouldn't change. There are better days gone than those that remain. But I can find joy in the sound of the rain.
Well, this is where, this is the spot where I stay, and this road winds away down there to the Forth, the River Forth is just beyond there, down to Preston Pans, and it used to be called the Old Salters Road, and I think it's where they used to pan for salt at Preston Pans on the river, and then wheel the salt inland into the borders up this road. I've written this song called Salters Road, and it talks about a lot of the places in this area where I stay now, and it's inspired by an old neighbour of ours called Molly Christensen, who used to live just opposite. She was a brilliant character, and knew everything about this area, like knew the name of every field and every little back track, and was nearly 90 years old when she died just a couple of years ago. And she was born in this area just a couple of miles away at Crichton, just over the hill, and just a fantastic, sparky wifey, and really made us welcome when we moved here. So I've written a song in her memory for Molly.
Okay.
We get a wee pheasant in the background. So this song's called Salters Road, and this is Salters Road.
She was waiting for a boy in her corduroy breeches, driving on a Clydesdale like her father once had done. From Mutton Hole to Preston Hall, through all the dales and ditches, and an avenue of burly beach that reached towards the sun. For miles and miles and miles she roamed, down Salters Road to Falladam and all the way home. For miles and miles and miles she drove. She was waiting for a boy in his trews of navy cotton. Something she had half forgotten is as clear as water now. The horseman's only daughter takes the Friday boat to Bergen, and the waves swell like a barley field that's ready to lay down. For miles and miles and miles she'd roam, down Salter's Road to Falladam and all the way home. For miles and miles and miles she'd roam. Down the spine of the St. Lawrence to Kirkwall's stony shore, the old north wind gathers her into his arms once more. And she was waiting for a boy, he came skipping down to greet her. Through the starch and bleach and buttons he was singing out her name. The evening clouds are huddled in so close that you could catch them, granite sheen upon the river and the shimmering of rain. For miles and miles and miles she'd roam, down Salter's Road to Falladam and all the way home. For miles and miles and miles she'd roam, down Windy Mains and Whippy-Law and all the way home. All the way home. All the way home. All the way home.
Thank you very much. That was a very moving piece of music from Camille Polwart. Always good to be reminded about the historical meaning of certain locations near where we are all trying to think about, the connection between the historical past and what we're trying to do in terms of reviving and ensuring that communities in rural areas are sustainable. So we're now going to move on to the question and answer session. One of the questions that we have had, and there's been a number of questions that relate to this in terms of the role that planning plays, and particularly the Planning Act 2019, and also what's in the National Planning Framework, that's the NPF4, which has just been launched. So if all the other panelists can put their cameras back on again, I'm afraid your work is not over yet. I don't know whether anyone wants to answer that question in terms of particularly if you see opportunities within the planning framework, or maybe even barriers in terms of what NPF4 and its provisions, for example, local place plans and things, how that could help to support communities around the provision of affordable housing.
I'll jump in because I'm loud and obnoxious.
Go for it, Ian.
I don't think I'm alone in saying that this latest raft of place planning operations has gone down well. It's an awful lot of work for communities to decide the things they want in their community, like housing, good transport, etc. It's another futile exercise in telling the authorities what their job should be and what they should be providing. We're hearing stories of some development trusts forking out tens of thousands of pounds they don't have to bring in consultants to tell them what they want, to tell the council what they want, and maybe they'll get it. And the whole, what it boils down to is, what's the criteria? How big is the pot? Does everyone get what they wish for? Or is it going to be based on need in populated areas? So that's quite frustrating, I'd say. And I would also add in, and I think we were talking about this recently, that compulsory sales orders might be coming back into a land reform bill, possibly, after NPF4 dropped it, which was daft, because I can understand the complications of it in urban and city settings, but in the rural, it's the difference between getting land, access to land for, community-led housing developments and economic revitalising, and not. So yeah, that's my two comments on that.
Thanks, Ewan. That's really helpful. Wendy, you've got your hand up. Please go next.
Yeah, I just wonder whether there's a potential issue with how long community place plans actually last and are valid for, and whether if things change within that time and housing wasn't picked up as an issue when they were first registered, whether or not that would then, because it's not in the local place plan or the community place plan, whether that would then prevent a community from being able to take forward a housing development further down the line because it's not in the plan. So, it's how flexible these things can be and how they will be able to reflect changing circumstances or even changing interest in a community. It might not be deemed important at 1 year, but 2 years, things change quite quickly. So it's just about the flexibility of all of that.
I think that's such an important point, Wendy. I mean, all the local community councils and councillors in my area over in Wester Ross are absolutely panicking at the moment about the need to develop local place plans and sort of trying to think about how they can do this without necessarily being able to access substantial pockets of resources. And the need for flexibility within the system is really key. Ariane, do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear things that are coming to light already. I mean, actually, I met with Highland Council Planning Department around NPF4, but actually I need to go back and meet with them on the housing. I was meeting with them on biodiversity, but I was impressed at how organized the council is, and they do seem to be kind of quite systematically going around different parts of Highland, whereas that's not happening in other places. So in one way, that might be a good thing. But yeah, I right from the get-go, when I learned about the local place plans being, feeding into the development plans, I could never fully understand how that was going to work. And it was that the 10-year of the local development plan would exactly what Wendy says, would the door open magically at some point when a community discovers they haven't fully bottomed out all of their needs or something. So the local government housing and planning committee will be reviewing it. So the good thing is that while we were able to feed into the first draft and we got some changes, but then once that draft came back, second draft, we couldn't get any changes. But what we do have is the ability to review the delivery plan and kind of raise issues with the government every year. So we're going to be looking at it in February. We're going to get ready to do that. So yeah, it is a big deal, and I think there's something there that maybe we need to be looking at. How do we get the funding to resource? And just today I was in another meeting about community councils and how they don't have any money in most places, and so if they need to be involved and engaged in this work, how do we support them to be able to do that well? And again, kind of coming back to a theme that's been rehearsed a lot here: volunteers doing it.
That's really helpful. Yeah, it's really good to know about these various different discussions. Polly, you've got your hand up, and Wendy, you have as well. So please, both of you, jump in.
Yeah, I think Ewan's point was that this is a lot of community groups don't have the capacity to do this because it is volunteers. So it's about how do you raise the money, and a lot of them in the Highlands have, they've got access to funding through wind farm money also, and as consultants, we will be benefiting from local place plans because it's something that we're going to get involved in doing. But wearing that hat, I am concerned. I know that we are always quite fair in our pricing, and I know, hand on heart, that we always try and do our best to do a really good job. But there are some unscrupulous consultants out there who will charge twice as much as us and produce poor work, which it really makes me quite uncomfortable. But I also think that there isn't a community in the land that won't say that housing is an issue, because we know it is. And I think that communities are going to have to jump through an awful lot of hoops to produce this place plan. But actually they could, most communities know what the issues are and they know what they want to see. But then the question, I think, again, it might have been you, I'm not sure, where is the money? Just because you say these are the needs, it doesn't mean that it's then going to follow through. So I'm slightly worried that communities are going to have to do an awful lot of work or raise a lot of money. But actually, where is it? What's actually going to come of it in the end? Because there isn't the money to necessarily deliver all the things that will come out of it. So,
no, I think that it's a really important point, Polly, it's one thing to develop a place plan. It's quite another to then think about how you how you resource the delivery of the community ambition that's outlined within it. Wendy.
Yeah, few thoughts. Going back to the need to have place plans registered and things. And the things that are in them. I have a slight concern that the experience of the Community Empowerment Act may come back to bite us in terms of asset transfer. Because prior to the Community Empowerment Act, local authorities had the ability to transfer assets. They've always been able to do it. And some did, some didn't. And the reason for the Community Empowerment Act was because a lot didn't, because they weren't, there was no requirement for them to do it, but they could. With the Community Empowerment Act, all asset transfers now, local authorities say, oh, you have to go through the process embedded in the Community Empowerment Act because that's how it's done. And actually that's added a huge amount of time and effort to a process that they had the ability to do before. So I worry with the local place plans that they're going to, for a community that maybe just wants to do a housing project, if they haven't done a community place plan, will there be a backlash in local authorities and others saying, oh, well, if you want to do these bigger projects, strategic projects, you need to demonstrate in your local place plans that there's a need for it, or that there's a, so I just worry that these things will start competing and adding extra layers of hoops or levels for communities to jump through. I think in terms of funding, it's really great that there's money, and there's often money, and government says, oh yes, we're funding all these organizations to support communities. If they resource communities directly, we wouldn't necessarily need all of these other support agencies to have as much funding to provide the support to the communities, because in doing that, the communities are still having to rely on volunteers to receive the support from these support agencies. So I think we need both. It's not one or the other, but there's nothing more frustrating when you see lots of funding going to support bodies to say, oh yes, we can provide this for you, we can provide that for you. You then have to make a funding application to get money to pay these people to actually access some of the support that they've got paid staff to deliver. And you as a community are doing all of this with minimal staff and volunteers who every time they want to do a project suddenly have to become experts in something new. And operate at a level that often university graduates are being paid to operate at, and parachute into the community, say, oh yeah, so there's something about really recognizing the need to put money directly into communities. And people think it's expensive, but if you just looked at the calculations Rhoda Meek did in her paper, 5 million quid out of 35 million of the Rural and Island Housing Fund is not a lot of money to unlock all of these projects that are sitting there waiting to happen. So it's great, but there is an assumption that once you get to community level, people will do it for nothing. And yet, if you're in a professional capacity, you get paid to do it. At what point will we see communities as being professional and volunteer boards as being professionals? Sorry, ran over.
No, I think you're absolutely, it's such a critical issue. Ewan, I can see your hand up, but I just want to try and also pick up some other questions from the panel. So I hope you can segue your comments, your response into the other things, because I've got two questions that really build on what you've just said, Wendy, in terms of the sort of capacity and resources, because Marie-Claire Bowser asked about sort of skilling or de-skilling as being one of these impacts from rural depopulation, and that connects also onto the question that Nick asked about one element of the, sorry, not Nick, sorry, this is a question from Ellie Logan from the Tay Valley Initiative, about one component of the de-skilling element is the sort of the massive lack of skilled tradespeople and contractors, and the high cost of material, and whether or not we need some kind of national level building company and procurement route for materials. That's what Ellie's suggesting. Other people have talked about how do we overcome the fundamental lack of builders, electricians, plumbers, people who can sign off air source heat pumps in remote rural areas, which is a huge ongoing challenge. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to try and touch on that. Wendy, you've got your hand up, so let's go to you first, and then maybe you, and I know you have views on this as well, if you want to say something.
I think it would be great if we could, as community organisations or small local companies, come together and form some kind of collaborative body that could deliver and could manage the procurement process. Egg have done it. So there are people on Egg that have done this. And I think it's a great model to go and have a look at, where there was a local build. My understanding, if my memory serves me correctly, is that there was a local house builder who trained up people locally on Egg in various skills, and they were able to then to bid for the contracts to do housing development on Egg. And I think it's called the Egg Building Company. I can't remember the exact details, but it's a really good example of how in smaller communities, individual people or small trades companies can come together to collectively bid for contracts. How easy it would be to do on a wider scale, I'm not sure, but there must be mechanisms and examples out there of doing it.
Thank you. Ewan, I'm chucking this one over to you as well. And then Chris, I can see your hand up as well. Thanks.
Okay. Wendy's just so much more articulate than me and summed up also nicely. Thank you, Wendy. Go back to place plans for a second. It feels like they're kicking it down the roads, but there is a nice little handy booklet that we can all tap into that'll tell us how to do it. Not how to raise the money, but what the booklet is. The last conversation, the SEDA talk I did, there was a really interesting comment in the chat from Dennis Overton about community consortiums coming together and actually being able to stop this waste of public money that will go off to these multinationals that come in to do our infrastructure work. Local, I made reference to it in my piece earlier on. A local car park councillor taking on the running of it is going to cost over £1 million for maybe resurfacing a bit of engineering work. And locally, we have enough contractors that are able to do it, and I've pushed them to try and get to be part of PCS. One of them already is. There's no hope in hell of them actually getting a major contract like that because of insurances, liabilities, etc., etc. So one thing the government could do is actually look at a way to, I don't know, be more efficient with the money they spend, actually investigate what the cost analysis, the benefit analysis is on these public procurement works in the north and in the south. I would also say Shori and Julia from Coyach left an interesting comment, because we all agree that out with the central belt, we're worried about depopulation. That's another one that the Scottish Government should be looking at, is, you know, not just resettlement officers, but really tackle depopulation, because, you know, for a country this size, we're woefully underpopulated. One of the polling questions I wanted to put through was that, is it about time that we, Scottish Government and Westminster, actually talk about giving some aspect of immigration control to the Scottish Government, so that we can actually start to repopulate these areas that are being drained of our young. There you go.
Thanks, Ewan. Chris.
Just a few thoughts on this business of, you know, there's not enough builders and tradesmen and all the rest of it, which is a sort of permanent theme that runs through my working life day to day, because we're proposing things that aren't necessarily feasible, you know, but that's what we're being asked to do. But they're, rather than, I mean, I find the whole public procurement thing exhausting because it's so unhelpful to so many of the things which it purports to want to achieve. And but I know I'm part of that, you know, sort of Glasgow-based architecture comes in and helps people, but you can then try to use your skill as much as you can to make it easier for people. But a number of things that are relevant to the sort of lack of skills thing. I suggested in my talk that there were sort of 3 ways into this. There's the affordable housing bit, there's the able to pay co-housing, which I know somebody said isn't able to pay, but, you know, fundamentally you're talking about people pooling mortgages and so on, at least at some level. And there's also the business of using private finance and employers locally putting into that. And in my experience, where you have co-housing and where you have local employers who want to contribute, you get around the public procurement bit. So in 2 of the 3 ways that we could develop housing, at least in part, you're not necessarily subject to public procurement rules in the same way. It's just worth noticing. I also think it's not just about people, it's about resources. So one of the things I'm always into is, you know, what local resources, so timber, all of these things. And I think that if you design buildings which can only be built by somebody in Glasgow or China or, you know, London, then then what are you going to get? You know, it's pretty obvious. So whereas if you can design buildings that could be built from things locally, then that would make more sense, right? The other thing is reducing this business about the core house is if you reduce the amount of special stuff and allow a lot more of that house to be locally developed in ways that you don't necessarily need to control, I think that reduces the nature of the problem. And the other reason that I'm interested in the empty houses, second homes and all of that is that most of my work these days is retrofit, and an awful lot of what constitutes the cost of retrofit can be done with relatively unskilled people. So you don't have to get some special wooden micro housing thing built in the borders and taken up to the Highlands. You can do your own insulation and your own windows. So there's lots of ways of reducing that burden of needing skilled tradesmen.
Thanks, Chris. That's really helpful. Ariane, I can see your hand up, and I was going to come to you next. I've also got, there's a couple of questions I wanted to particularly flag as well from the comments that I was going to pass on to you. Polly, also, I want to just give you a heads up that I was going to come to you to see if you had a view on this question about regenerative settlements, taking a broader approach to sort of the socioeconomic and environmental considerations in relation to housing, and whether Scotland could follow what's being done in Wales there. I don't know if that's something you have a view on, just to give you a heads up on that. But Ariane, so if you were going to, I think, respond to what Wendy and you and Chris had said, but I also wanted to ask, there was a question for you, particularly around levels of insulation being balanced against local renewable energy. And also I was wondering if you could point one of the audience members to a good definition of what microhousing is. And you've still got your mute on.
Thank you. So yeah, on the skills thing, where I go is, can we have a model of a house in every school, and kids go and do stuff with that house, and they learn to put up doors and build window frames and take things down and have a practical experience in school? Because it's amazing, you know. It's like, I remember the first time I ever took down a wall, you know, with a sledgehammer. It was fantastic. It was so empowering to discover what was behind that wall, and the lath and all those things. So I would love to see something like that in schools, where, you know, and it really starts to become a pathway where kids think, yeah, that's something I want to do. And there's so many kids that don't want to do the sitting behind the computer. They want to do the practical hands-on joinery or all that kind of stuff. So I keep going back to school. I go back to school again for the whole community volunteer thing. We need much more skills development in terms of kids in primary school learning how to take decisions and you know, make decisions. I absolutely want kids to play and have loads of playtime, but also some skill sets early on where they're starting to learn how to work together and collaborate. But actually play does kind of create that cooperative way of being. In terms of levels of insulation and local renewables, can you, I didn't catch that. I've been kind of trying to scroll through the questions. I need a bit more nuance there, Megan, on what they're actually asking me. And in terms of definition of micro housing, I don't have anything that I can give that person yet, but because we're probably going to do a SEDA Land session on micro housing, and I think it would be much better for Bernard Planterose and Karen Grant, who along with Chris, I think, worked on the Hutters building standard, you know, to get them involved and you know, have that conversation. But I think Bernard would be the person to go to in terms of getting the outward facing idea of micro housing like written down. But I do want to say, because I did catch a comment of somebody saying they live in a cold or dark space. I have been to a kind of prototype of what Bernard's talking about, and it is the most stunning, incredible, beautiful timber built space with nice big window looking out onto the forest. And so I think, you know, we need to really understand, and I also really want to emphasize that, and I'm seeing in the chat too about it, is that this is like a both and. We absolutely need the housing that's full featured and on, but what we're talking about here is this urgency to get young people in particular into communities. And I met a young person in Applecross this summer who, because she had a toehold in the community, is now there and beginning to make the connections to find a longer term situation. So that, I think that's some of what I'm trying to do with the micro housing. I absolutely want I come from, you know, co-housing and community design and development and all that stuff. But I think we need to find these little interventions that can get us more people into our communities with urgency.
Thanks, Ariane. I will try and find this question about insulation and pass it back to you in a minute. Polly, did you have any thoughts on regenerative settlements?
Sorry, no, I don't know enough about it to comment, but I wanted to go back to the previous comment about procurement, in that community benefit clauses, I think, have a huge potential if they're used properly, to actually change the way that, you know, to enable more local builders where they exist. And notice someone said that they've lost quite a lot, but if you have really strong community benefit clauses in your procurement documents, then it does force the bigger builders to start using subcontracting to local builders. And I think they were tried 15 years ago, and I think the timing was wrong, but I think that everything has shifted now, and I think there's a lot of potential to use those to a greater extent. So that was going to be my bit there. And we also, the procurement process is really tricky, and there are lots of clauses in there that almost send contracts down the A9 from the Highlands, and not making that link at the public level between economic development and procurement is a real loss. But to answer your specific question, I'm afraid I don't know enough about it to comment. I was trying to quickly Google to see if I could contribute anything, but I didn't manage quickly enough, so I'm sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine, Polly. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I'm afraid we are drawing to a close. There was one final question which I wanted just to put to the panel. There's a question from Morgan Fancy, who asked, do we have an affordable housing crisis in rural areas? Now, the term affordable housing crisis gets bandied around in rural areas so often that I think that we maybe I certainly do. I sort of take that as given that this is the situation we are facing. But I want to ask if any of the panelists would actually make the case that we don't have an affordable housing crisis, that this isn't a problem, because maybe that answers Morven's question more, that if all of the panelists, if anyone, unless anyone disagrees with that view, that is very much the situation that we are facing. Chris, go ahead.
No, the only thing I would say, I'm not going to say it, it's too controversial, but the only thing I would say is that what I don't agree is that we have a housing crisis for which new build housing will be the only solution. And that's the bit that makes me nervous, because new build housing is A, expensive, B, difficult, B, C, builders, and it's environmentally damaging, even if it's really eco and all the rest of it. So lots of other solutions strike me as being a much more creative response. But it's just to say that because I think people tend to see it as that.
Thanks, Chris. Wendy, over to you for something very short.
You know, I think I was just going to say I agree with that. I think the other worry about the way housing is dealt with is that they put out it's done at scale, and actually what we're needing, where the crises are, a lot of the crises are happening, is in smaller rural communities where you're never going to get housing built at scale. So if we're talking about putting 11,000 houses into rural communities, they're probably going to go into the larger settlements, which isn't actually then going to address some of the issues that we're all talking about, which are facing the smaller rural communities at the edge of depopulation. So there's got to be room for small scale, very locally designed solutions to some of that stuff.
Thank you, Wendy. I think you've just very eloquently made the case that the SEDA Land series on building rural futures and thinking about sustainable placemaking can't stop at session number 4. There needs to be some more sessions, because we've despite everyone's incredible contributions, and thanks also for all of the amazing questions, we simply seem to finish with a list of even more questions and topics that need to be answered, need to be discussed and answered together. I'm afraid I'm now, as chair, going to have to be very sorry that I'm going to have to try and wrap up this conversation. This event is concluding now. I want to thank all of you who participated, our panelists, Wendy Reid, Kate Hagman, who unfortunately, although she couldn't be here on the actual event this evening, contributed some really great ideas. Before the event, to Ewan McLaughlin, Polly Chapman, Ariane Burgess and Chris Morgan, I want to thank our contributing artists, Lisa MacDonald, Pauline Pryor-Pitt and Karine Polwart. And I want to thank also the back of house team, Stephen, Eleanor, John, and of course, Gail. And I also want to thank all of you who have attended. This has been a really fascinating discussion. We've had a whole range of different issues. I think it's been very useful to think about not just building on the previous 2 sessions, but also thinking towards the 4th session, which is focusing on what kind of response maybe is needed from the Scottish Government. And there's been some really excellent suggestions around the need for some changes in policy. We've got the new Rural and Islands Housing Action Plan with some suggestions in that. There are some key questions that have come out of the discussion this afternoon. A few that have struck me really strongly is the need to see housing within a broader context and the connections, and have a holistic approach to sustainable placemaking that values affordable housing, not simply in terms of having more places for people to live in, but what that means for the school role, for the provision of broader public services, the wider educational, economic, social and well-being type impacts that housing provides to ensure that rural communities like ours are resilient and have a future. The role of financing, how do we finance it? Different innovative finance solutions, the need for different types of funding earlier, funding for communities in terms of resources and capacity, more funding for groups, the amazing work of groups like the Communities Housing Trust, to let them do more of what they're doing and do it better. All of this, I think, has been really flagged, as has this question of what's the way of finding flexible, smaller co-housing, micro-housing, tiny house, different options that does that in a way which is enabling the provision of greater affordable homes in rural communities without compromising on quality and energy efficiency and making sure that people actually have good homes to live in. So I think there's a lot more to continue to discuss on this. As I said, the 4th and apparently last SEDA conversation on this is Building Futures in Rural Scotland, which is aimed at the Scottish Government, and this will be held in the new year. So please look out on the SEDA Land website for more details for that. Please take a look at the SEDA Land New Resources pages, which is the first stop to find out about all the different land-related conversations that SEDA has held on all the different resources. There are 2 additional SEDA Land events in November. The first one both of them taking a look at carbon finance and the checks and balances that are needed in place, and how communities might benefit from the rush into the natural capital market in Scotland. And there are full details about both of these on the SEDA website. And of course, if you'd like to support SEDA, please become a member or subscribe to the newsletters where you get information about future events. So thank you all very much for this fascinating conversation, and I hope you have a good evening. Goodbye.